If you've enjoyed my storytelling on this season of Scene of the Crime, you might also enjoy another true crime podcast I host called Murderish. Here is a preview. Hi, I'm Jamie, host of Murderish, a true crime podcast that provides a 3D look at gripping murder cases from beginning to end. You'll get to know the victims and perpetrators, how their worlds collided, and what went down during trial. I also share some of my own personal experiences, like the time a stranger came into my bedroom at night. Yeah, that really happened, and I walk you through all the details of that terrifying night. Have you ever wanted to be a fly on the wall during a murder trial? You'll get that opportunity on Murderish, as I share my experience being a jury foreman on a first-degree murder trial. Search Murderish in your favorite podcatcher app, hit subscribe, and start binging. And remember, listening to this podcast doesn't make you a murderer. It just means you're murder-ish.
You're listening to Scene of the Crime, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, 3 Men and a Mystery, Malice, and DNA ID. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
In our previous episode, we took a deep dive into serial killer Charles Hatcher, uncle to Marcella Atkinson. As we heard, Charles is generally not believed by law enforcement to be the killer of Roger and Rose. But no one is really sure. There is still an element of doubt as to whether he could be the person who hacked them to death in room 260 in September 1980. And that just about sums up this case. 40 years after the deaths of Roger Atkinson and Rose Burkert, there continues to be a plethora of suspects and possible scenarios, and no resolution. Here is Sheriff Rotter.
You've got a man who's cheating on his wife with a younger girl, so there's a litany of emotions that come from that if you're connected to the family. So motive comes along with it. And I always figure if you can figure out the motive, you can track that motive back to the person who did it. But when you have so many different motives and so many different angles, how much time do you spend on each one of them? And the fact of the matter is they've all had enormous amount of time devoted to them, years. And yet here we are, without a solution.
And here is Rose's friend, Tammy Berkman.
Everybody thought everybody did it.
Part of the problem is there is not even universal agreement as to the nature of Roger and Rose's killer. Here is Elizabeth Atkinson.
I don't think it was a serial killer. It was personal.
Marcella, who lost her husband, agrees.
I just really can't buy that it was a random killing, that somebody wandered off the highway and did this. I just don't believe that that's what happened.
And Lieutenant Mike Herter of the St. Joseph PD, who worked the case for years until his death, told the St. Joseph News Press that he thinks the killer was, quote, fairly well known to one or both victims. Vicki Ruoff, Rose's friend, says,
after all this time, I'm really not sure. At first, I could have swore it was because it was from this cult thing. But after all this time, I really don't know, because part of me says they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Another part of the problem is, all these years later, no one really understands why Roger and Rose were murdered in the first place. And there are those who believe there was no reason, because Rose and Roger died at the hands of someone they did not know. This means that the two schools of thought on the Atkinson-Burkert murder are that A, either someone who knew them wanted them dead, or B, they were the victims of a random attack. The two possibilities could not be further apart. Margie Lowry, Rose's sister, summed it up succinctly.
It's always been a battle.
We have exhaustively considered the possibilities that Roger and Rose were targeted by someone in either of their lives who killed them in a crime of passion. And that remains a strong possibility. But what about the other theory? That they were killed by a stranger who just happened upon them. And this stranger may have been responsible not just for Roger and Rose's murders, but those of William Kyle and Jack McDonald as well? For many members of the family, the concept of a serial killer murdering their loved ones is just too random, too remote a possibility to hold much water. But others disagree. For some, the belief that a serial killer was responsible is a relief, because it means that no one in Roger and Rose's circles killed them. Here is Joan Halter.
We believe that, or maybe we want to believe that.
And it is certainly in the realm of possibility. In the eyes of some of the experts on these cases, these three different hotel murders are inextricably linked together by circumstantial evidence that points to one offender in all three crimes. Let's consider whether a serial killer could have killed Roger, Rose, William Kyle, and Jack McDonald. As Paul Holes said to us,
let's see if we can't solve this thing.
Paul Holes acknowledges that
victims of serial killers is small relative to being victims of interpersonal relationships, somebody they know, or a victim of a crime of a different motive, whether it be financial, whether it be drug related.
Iowa investigators devoted almost the entirety of their investigation to examining potential suspects known to Roger and Rose. But despite the rarity of serial killers and the remoteness of the possibility that a serial killer is responsible in any one case, here we have three cases that are eerily akin to one another. And Paul Holes endorses the serial killer theory. For this seasoned, esteemed investigator who spent significant amounts of time reviewing the case files and speaking to investigators on the ground, the parallels among the three hotel murder cases are too numerous to be coincidental.
There are active serial killers, but they're rare. And so it's very unlikely to fall victim of a serial killer, but obviously it happens. And I do think that's what happened to Roger and Rose.
Paul covered the three hotel murders in the premiere episode of his hit Oxygen show, The DNA of Murder, and he spoke with us at length about the serial killer theory.
As I started taking a look more at this crime scene, then I start backing away from, well, is this somebody that truly is upset about the affair, or was this a random, let's say, robbery that turned into a double homicide? Or is there something more nefarious going on? Why is he spending the time to not only take every single item out of Roger's wallet, but also tearing a photograph of a young girl up, tearing other things up? There's something more going on in the offender's mind. And because he's focusing this additional energy on Roger's wallet, he's not going into Roger's wallet just to get money. He would have just opened that wallet up, grabbed the money. I mean, there was credit cards back in the day, but they weren't being, stolen like what you would think. And he would have just tossed the wallet. That would have been a typical robbery type situation. The offenders aren't going to do like this guy did and tear everything up and throw each item individually down on the floor. There's something more going on. There's things that the offender does that only he knows, why he's doing those particular things. And when you have extracurricular activities that the offender is taking the time to do at the crime scene that is not there to accomplish committing the crime, either accomplish a homicide, accomplish a sexual assault, accomplish, some sort of personal gain, such as financial. Why is he doing these additional activities? And you generally don't see that in interpersonal crimes.
Paul points out that the killer, whoever killed Roger and Rose, and, he believes, William and Jack, spent time in the hotel rooms with his victims, going through their things, cleaning up, and leaving some bizarre aspects of the crime scene behind. This displays a level of confidence, a sophistication, a presence of mind that is absent in most crimes of passion.
And then he sits in a chair. And I believe he is sitting in the chair on Roger's side of the bed when he is dissecting Roger's wallet. He is comfortable. This is a double homicide, yet he is comfortable being in that space. This is where I start adding this up and think, you know what? He possibly has done this before. Even in series where it's known to be the same offender, there are differences from case to case to case. You know, offenders do different things at different times for different reasons. But I have never had a series that had such a unique combination of behaviors that this offender is doing in these three cases. That's why I'm so confident about Rose and Roger falling victim to a serial killer. And that's what I told both Rose and Roger's families.
According to Paul, the brazen hotel murders were committed by someone accustomed to killing. The killer in these cases beset his victims in busy hotels with a weapon that could not easily be obscured. He kept all of the victims from making sounds, betraying his actions. He left no recognizable prints. He managed to depart the hotels despite the blood evidence and while carrying a hatchet or similar weapon undetected.
That would possibly suggest he knows he can get away with this type of crime because he's done it before. There's too much here to think that he's some inexperienced person who's just flying off in a rage, going into this hotel room and spending all this time and allowing these victims to possibly escape. It starts to open up doors into other possibilities of who this offender is.
Paul says that at first, once he determined that Roger and Rose's killing was not an interpersonal crime, based on the strange stack of clues at the Holiday Inn crime scene, he questioned whether,
is this a serial killer? Is this a hitman? I mean, you could go either way.
But the single common element in this case that for Paul Holes cements the serial killer theory is one that no doubt seemed mundane to crime scene investigators at the time. Of course, we are talking about the toothpaste. Initially, in the Amana case, it was believed that the toothpaste was simply a cleaning solution for a bloodied killer. Here are Larry and Elizabeth Atkinson.
We knew in the very beginning, Flockett told us, that the murder weapon had been cleaned up in the toilet stool and that they used toothpaste to clean the murder weapon and the sink.
But it was quickly recognized that the toothpaste had also been found in the Galesburg crime scene and that perhaps it had more significance. Here is Margie Lowry.
I heard them over talking about the toothpaste tube, about having to find it wherever, if it was somewhere in the hotel or in the trash or whatever. So I knew there was something about that they needed to clear up. I don't know whose toothpaste it was. I just know that they wanted it because they felt that it was important evidence that there was a similar thing that associated with the murder that had been done before, that they felt they might have a link in between the two of them.
The toothpaste in the Kyle case was found near the body, on the carpeted floor, not somewhere where it would have been used for cleaning. Then, toothpaste was also found in the hotel room in Meridian where Jack McDonald died 10 years before the others. Paul Holes says that in his entire career, he has never seen toothpaste figure into a crime scene, yet here it is in all three cases.
Where exactly was the toothpaste tube found? Because the photographs show it in one location, and it turns out that, it was actually found by an investigator, kind of stuffed in, I think it was a Kleenex, a tissue dispenser, and then somebody else had taken it out of that tissue dispenser and placed it, on the shelf above the toilet. So we have an altered crime scene. And so kind of eliminating that alteration and seeing that this toothpaste tube had been put in the tissue dispenser, it's very unlikely that Roger or Rose would have done that. Seems like the offender put it there. And then that's when I start thinking, okay, so maybe, this toothpaste was squeezed out by the offender. And I know Sheriff Rodder had a theory at one point when I was talking to him that possibly the offender was using the toothpaste like a soap, like to be able to clean. Toothpaste sometimes is used to polish jewelry, for example. Was he doing something like that? But it just kind of underscores that when you look at something like an oddity like that, I know I focused in on it, and then I start developing multiple reasons for why that is there. But then I need more information to try to clarify, well, what is going on here? It was in the Rose and Roger case file. So there was I believe it was an Iowa State Patrol investigator who said, hey, out in Galesburg, there was this William Kyle case, and he had written a list of the similarities between Rose and Roger's case and the William Kyle case.
Paul says because of the oddity of the toothpaste in all three cases, he began to look at the startling number of similarities in the three murders.
It's not just the toothpaste. The toothpaste is obviously, the bizarre oddity, but it is hatcheting deaths in hotel rooms adjacent to freeways, males found in their underwear, the men's wallets being rifled through. And this is where now, when I see this stack of behaviors, as well as three cases separated geographically as well as temporally across 10 years, Rose and Roger's case is not an interpersonal crime. They fell victim to a serial killer who is roving around the country, hatcheting people to death. And I think he's got others out there across the nation.
Paul addresses for us whether the toothpaste could be the killer's MO or a signature.
In some ways, it can be very easily defined, but to interpret MO versus signature in an unsolved case can be near impossible. And let me kind of explain a little bit, is that MO is what an offender does in order to accomplish the crime. So this is going to be something along the lines of an offender is a very accomplished burglar, and he's very good at breaking into a house. And he breaks into houses in order to get inside to get access to whatever he wants access to. He may have a unique way of defeating a locking mechanism, but it's something he has learned and he does to commit the crime. It's not something he is needing to do to satisfy an interfantasy.
He says investigators came to the conclusion that the toothpaste was not just an MO, something used as a cleaning agent to remove blood from the killer's person, but a signature, something the killer did to help him achieve satisfaction from his crime. But what possible satisfaction could toothpaste provide? Does the killer love fresh breath? Was it possibly a lubricant? No, according to Paul, it's something else.
Obviously, the squirting out of the toothpaste is not something the offender needs to do to commit the crime. So why is he doing that? And then when I hear from the Galesburg detective, when he starts investigating that back, in the early 1980s, and that this was something that heroin addicts would do in order to simulate ejaculation because they can't get it up because of their heroin addiction, that becomes interesting. And that puts a spin on the possibility that Rose and Roger's case is potentially a sexually motivated case, even though it isn't apparent just looking at the crime scene the way it is.
Full stop here. Paul Holes, one of the most esteemed investigators of our time, tells us that heroin addicts are believed to use toothpaste to simulate ejaculation because the drugs they ingest eventually cause erectile dysfunction. So who, throughout the story of Roger, Rose, William, and Jack, was known to use drugs? Raimundo Esparza. We discussed him at length in episode 8. Here is Paul.
Esparza, he was heavily involved in drug use, particularly heroin. LA authorities were dealing with him on a fairly frequent basis and doing probation checks on him. The heroin aspect with the toothpaste was, such a bizarre bit of information that the Galesburg detective told me in terms of, simulating ejaculation, because heroin addicts oftentimes can't get an erection and can't get themselves to ejaculate. But what they will do is they will squirt toothpaste in order to simulate ejaculation, and they get some sort of sexual satisfaction from that.
This habit of using toothpaste to recreate sexual climax, if true, could provide another circumstantial link to Esparza. Galesburg investigators put all their eggs in the Esparza basket. Tom LaFollette and Bob Horton say they believe Esparza killed William Kyle and that the case is closed. But what about Roger and Rose? Could Esparza have killed them as well? Investigators believe that he may have been in Iowa at the time of the murders, but that is the only, albeit remote, connection. Nonetheless, Paul Hull says,
Esparza is such a compelling suspect in the Kyle case that I have to consider, because I think the signature of everything the offender is doing in those two cases it's so overlapping that Esparza has to be a prime suspect in Rose and Roger's case.
Furthermore, there is some word-of-mouth evidence that Esparza may have been in Meridian, Mississippi at the time of the McDonald case as well.
Galesburg detective tells me that he knew about the Jack McDonald case when he was investigating William Kyle and was talking to Meredith PD about that case. And then that Galesburg detective said that he was able to place Esparza in the vicinity of at the time of the Jack McDonald case. But of course, he didn't write that in the case file, and he doesn't remember how he did that. I don't doubt him. He is still very sharp on the details to this day. It's not in writing. If what he is saying is accurate, you've got Esparza at the time of the Jack McDonald case, who was killed in the identical manner as William Kyle, where Esparza was in the very hotel eating at that restaurant that night. And then 6 weeks later, you've got Rose and Roger killed. And basically, Roger's killed in the identical manner, as these two other males found in his underwear. Slight differences, and I think that's due to the two victims versus one. And then we have toothpaste squirted in all three cases. When you start looking at these other cases, it's like, no, I'm not seeing that at all. And maybe someday I'll be proven wrong, but right now I'm as confident as I've ever been in assessing multiple cases as being related. What's the most likely? And putting the energies and the efforts there until you eliminate that. And that's where I'm at, is that this is a serial killer. I think Esparza is the likely killer in all three cases.
If the Galesburg detectives who tracked Esparza's movements are correct, and there is some indication that he may have been in Mississippi in 1970, that is compelling. Here is Sheriff Rotter.
And of course, there's the toothpaste in the tub. Now, originally, and we might still be correct, is it was thought that perhaps they used the toothpaste to clean up maybe some jewelry, some rings, wristwatch, whatever. I remember as a kid my mom using toothpaste to clean her jewelry, so I knew that was a thing. Did it have anything to do with the murder? We don't know. But then we find out that Esparza, in at least two other cases that he's a suspect in, keeping in mind that Esparza was never convicted of anything, but there were two cases that he was a suspect in. In those cases, there was toothpaste shot out of a tube as well. So is that indicative of the fact that he was there and that's just one of the things he does or not? It's hard to say, but it's one of those things that we've looked at. Esparza wouldn't know these two people. So it makes me question whether I was right. Obviously, we don't know if Esparza is our killer or not, but if he was, that negates my belief of it being a crime of passion. It's just a sick serial killer in that case.
He continues.
I believe that Esparza probably, again, keeping in mind he's never, ever been convicted of anything as far as these go, But he made his way around. We know that he spent a lot of time along Interstate 80. He spent a lot of time in California. Here he is. He dies in Iowa City, but he's buried in Los Angeles. I mean, he's made his way around. And so if he was a serial killer, how many people did he kill? It's mind-boggling to think how many times he could have done this if he's our guy. It really is hard to give up on Esparza. It really is. It kind of explains something. If it was Esparza, it explains why there's so many dead ends in all the leads going back to St. Joseph. Because no matter how good the suspect looked and how much motive somebody might have had, we hit dead ends. We hit really good alibis. We hit just all kinds of roadblocks, which would be explained by the fact that maybe they didn't do it. Maybe none of these people in St. Joseph did it, and it's all Esparza.
Of course, there is one other person we have discussed in these episodes who may have had the same use for the toothpaste, someone who admitted to suffering from erectile dysfunction, possibly due to his being an alcoholic. And this person was known to spend time in Iowa and in Galesburg, and to travel around the Midwest, and to be a multiple murderer. This is Charles Hatcher. If you recall, he told investigators that he was unable to get an erection. Again, it defies belief that Charles, relative of Roger Atkison's, just happened to be responsible for multiple hotel murders, including Roger's. But it is possible that Charles did kill Roger and Rose at someone else's behest, used the toothpaste as an ejaculate substitute, and had nothing to do with the other two crimes. Paul Holes believes that the killer, whether Esparza or some other unsub, may have struck room 260 because of its location within the hotel. From the parking lot where Rose's car was parked, an outsider would be able to see the lights on in room 260 and someone moving around inside. He would be able to tell that that room would be easily accessible to someone entering through the external door that led up to the room. And it was nowhere near the bustling, inhabited lobby and restaurant area with all the witnesses those places would provide. In other words, he may have decided on that room simply because of circumstances and ease of escape. He may not even have known how many people were in there. Here is Paul.
And I'm assuming that he knows that there was two in there. I'm not entirely confident about that.
Perhaps Roger and Rose really were just victims of circumstance. If indeed the hotel murders were the work of a serial killer, then all the hours law enforcement spent devoted to interpreting the bizarre clues left behind by the killer and how they related to the victims were pointless. Those clues had nothing whatsoever to do with Roger, Rose, William, or Jack. They were just a serial killer's mad behaviors at work. Here is Sheriff Rotter.
We've started to realize how much time and effort we've put into all the little nuances inside the room and things that may or may not have happened, and who was killed first and how entry was made. And it's all very intriguing, but we've gotten to the point where we just need to know who did it. Some of the answers to those questions might actually point to the murderer, but so far they haven't. If it's an Esparza serial killer, then of course none of that matters. And that's just one more indication of how crazy this case is, where you have all these reasons why someone might want to kill Roger and Rose, and yet none of them did it, and it's somebody completely unrelated.
Sheriff Rotter tells us that in 1980, the Mid-States Organized Crime Information Center, an information-sharing agency serving Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, and Wisconsin, was newly formed.
Organization called MOCIC, which is a intel sharing agency that actually we still work with today, that is basically a Midwestern intel sharing for law enforcement. MOCIC is brand new. It was just developed, just preceding this case. And so they were involved right from the beginning, and they're the ones that actually thought that Esparza was a good good suspect, and brought in the idea that this could be a serial killer, looking at the murder that happened in Illinois. It's similar in the cause of death. What is not similar is, in that case, Esparza was believed to be a closeted homosexual who acted out violently.
Rotter says that if indeed a serial killer struck Roger and Rose, and the toothpaste served as an ejaculation substitute, then the killer's target could have been Roger.
Is it possible that this really is Esparza and that Rose just ends up being collateral damage?
The reality is, no one knows. And because of the age of these cases, the McDonald case is 50 years old this year, and the others are 40, we may never know if there are additional, similar cases dating back decades. We've already seen that many of the pre-computer era investigators did not take ample notes and went from memory in their investigations. Here is Sheriff Rotter.
The thing we have going against us here is a lot of these murders that took place in around 1980 or pre-1980 are not documented well on the internet. Some are, some aren't. And that's really what you're kind of left to, is finding something that was written about it and it ended up on the internet. Because what other avenue do you use? The people that work in these agencies don't have a clue that they have these cases. We have reached out to the FBI, and of course they're a very busy agency and they only can do so much, but they are trying to look at other cases that they have in their files.
And that leads us to where the case stands today. In 2009, the Iowa DCI assigned Roger and Rose's case to its newly created cold case unit. But if there have been any recent developments, it has not been revealed publicly. When we requested a copy of the DCI's file on the Burkert-Atkinson murder case earlier this year, our request was denied. We were told, quote, "This is an unresolved criminal investigation, and the release of this file is protected from disclosure." The two St. Joseph detectives who spent the most time on the case, Jim Wright and Mike Herter, have both died. Sheriff Slockett is long since retired. But as we have seen throughout this story, Iowa County Sheriff Rob Rotter continues doggedly to work this case, and he is bringing modern technology to the table to try to solve it. Here is Sheriff Rotter.
It was actually around 2015, Iowa County had just completed doing several murder trials. Unfortunately, we had some new murders that we had to deal with, and really, we were so used to working murder cases there for a while and seeing them through court that we were kind of thinking, well, shoot, we're kind of going down the road with this type of work. Let's keep going with these unsolved ones. So we got those out and we unpacked all the evidence. This is evidence that's been sealed up literally since the early 1980s. And we were looking to see if there was any DNA angle that hadn't been explored yet. It's a massive amount of material that we have, and we just laid it out on large tables in our staff room and just started going through some what ifs.
Sheriff Rotter said that they had ample DNA from Roger and Rose to work with, but they were interested in someone else.
We have all kinds of DNA for the victims. Really, we're looking for the DNA of the murder, of course.
When Sheriff Rotter pulled out all of the evidence on the Atkinson-Burkert case, he found that it was collected, sealed, and stored properly and in accordance with protocols of the time. They still have the toothpaste tube, Roger's wallet and hot lather machine, and lots of other items from room 260. And there was material on some of the items from room 260 that they observed might be conducive for DNA extraction using the latest technology. Rotter and his deputies determined the items most likely to contain the DNA of the murderer.
One of the things we noticed in the evidence was that there were some towels that had been recovered from the bathroom of the hotel room. And I always try to put myself in the position of the murderer. We're thinking, as you walk into the bathroom, you just killed two people, and you you did it in a way that made quite a bit of mess. And so the first thing you're going to see when you walk into that bathroom is yourself in the mirror. Now, there's no way that you don't have blood all over you. And you're seeing that for the first time. And it's got to be quite a sight. So knowing that there's towels there, we got to think that the person would have tried to clean themselves up somewhat. So one of the angles we had was, what if they used these towels? What if they washed up, wiped their face, whatever, with these towels? Is there a chance it has DNA?
They sent the towel found on the sink in room 260, the one with blood smears on it, and some other items in for DNA testing. And they were able to isolate a third party's DNA.
There's a hand towel that was on the counter that was sent to Iowa DCI lab and checked for DNA. We found that we had the DNA of both victims smeared by way of blood smears, and then intermingled in that is a third male DNA that at this point is still unknown as to who it is.
The male unsub's DNA from the towel did not come from blood or semen. Here is Sheriff Rotter.
One of the things that the lab can do is identify what it is not. It is not blood and is not semen. So it is very likely sweat or saliva, or lack of a better term, could be snot, could be really anything other than those two things. I personally think it's probably a combination of sweat and saliva. I think about what this person might have gone through while they did all this horrible stuff. I imagine they were nervous and scared to a point, probably did a certain amount of sweating. And of course, they've got blood all over them. There's no way they don't. So they're really scrubbing their face. So they could have caught part of their mouth or whatever. So I think that's what it is. It's probably sweat and or saliva. And it's just mixed in with the blood of the victims.
Sheriff Rotter confirmed in an email to us, quote, "The manner in which the DNA is smeared onto the towel with the victim's blood helps me believe this is the DNA of the killer. The sample from the towel, for now, is the best sample that is obtainable from the evidence gathered in room 260 in 1980.
It's actually in pretty decent shape considering the age. We look for 21 loci, 21 markers essentially in DNA, and this has 19, which is actually pretty good. We've done touch DNA on every single item that we can possibly think of that was touched by the perpetrator, and we have not been able to find any DNA profiles on those items. And unfortunately, touch DNA, while it's very good, keep in mind these pieces of evidence weren't handled with the idea in mind that they would someday be swabbed. So while they weren't necessarily cleaned or anything, they might have been handled by people, and regardless, we're not identifying any DNA profiles on any of the objects that we were confident that the killer touched.
In 2016, Sheriff Rotter combined his DNA efforts with a renewed investigation on the ground. He personally visited St. Joseph, Missouri.
It's one thing to read reports about what somebody says, especially when those reports were written so long ago, and it's another thing to actually sit down with those people and talk about it. So one of the things that Todd Sauerbrei and I wanted to do was talk to those people and just discover whether or not anything new had come to their mind since their original statements way back when. And did they have any ideas? A lot of these people are very interested, obviously, in this case. Did they have some ideas of what we should be looking at? Or are they thinking, why don't they go talk to so-and-so? Why didn't they ever talk to him? Well, those are the types of things we were looking for. And so it was really just to kind of go over what they had said back then. And it's amazing how some people really couldn't remember. And then, we got as much information as we could. We didn't want to taint them with their old statements, but after they had given as much as they could give, then we actually would present, in some cases, their original statements. And then a lot of that would come flooding back to them. It was like, oh yeah, I forgot all about that. Yeah, that's true. That did happen. But it was just a way to see if anybody had come up with any new thoughts, and if anyone maybe, if somebody did lie to us, did they forget what their lie was, and would they mess up? And that didn't happen. Really, everybody that I've wanted to talk to, I've been able to talk to, not once but numerous times. I've never had anyone not talk to me.
Another thing he did was request blood samples from the people he spoke with. Sheriff Rotter emphasized for us just how much work has gone into the DNA recovery and subsequent investigative efforts to pinpoint a suspect. Rotter says they have been able to use the DNA to rule individuals out as suspects, even if not to find a suspect.
That's what we've been doing here for the last couple of years now, is we are gathering the DNA of as many people as we can possibly think of. And we've had a lot of cooperation from people. I think people who maybe considered themselves suspects or think, well, my goodness, I could have been a suspect in this, or are eager to show that they weren't.
For example, Mike H. If you recall, we devoted a lot of time, just as investigators did, to the question of whether Mike H. could have been the killer of Roger and Rose. But Mike was one of the many, many people who have cooperated with the DNA investigation, and he was ruled out.
He had absolutely no issue whatsoever granting us that DNA. He was more than willing to do it without any hesitation.
We reached out to Mike H. in connection with this podcast, but received no response. Rotter says the DNA has been instrumental in checking people off the suspect list.
I would think we're probably over a dozen. There are people that we use DNA for, not maybe expecting to get a direct ID from it, but maybe someone they were related to. Because obviously we've lost a lot of people since this happened. So we were not only comparing DNA to DNA, but DNA to someone who has similar DNA, who you might say that's a relative to the killer. That's the best we can do with that when we're talking about the familial DNA, the ancestry type stuff. Yeah, we can't do that, but we can still kind of take it to at least a lower level and see if we have people who might be related to the person who has that unknown DNA on the towel. We have not been turned down for DNA by anybody at this point.
Another person who was ruled out after a family member submitted their DNA was J.C. Halter. His DNA would have been a partial match to Rose's, since they were half-siblings. The male unsub was not related to Rose or to Roger by blood. And another suspect, the target of the investigation for years, was also ruled out. The male DNA found on the towel, commingled with the blood of Roger and Rose, does not match that of Danny B. Of course, there is also the possibility that the DNA found on the towel does not belong to the killer, but to someone else.
We do have another problem, though, and that is there's always that chance that this DNA belongs to somebody else, and somebody that's not involved in the crime. And that's something you have to realize. Could the DNA have been put there on that towel before the blood, or maybe even after, through some sort of mistake by someone? And that's always a possibility. And so one of the things we're trying to do as well is eliminate people who would have been in the room as far as the investigation goes. There is not a single law enforcement officer who was in that room that is still alive today, including the county coroner. They're all gone. One of the last DNAs that we're actually still waiting on final testing is the next of kin to the county coroner. If he somehow manipulated maybe the heads to look for the wounds and what have you, he might have touched the bodies enough to get blood on, and would he have gone into the bathroom and cleaned up? Again, you got to put yourself back to 1980. The only thing anybody is worried about in those days is fingerprints, and we know you're not going to lift a fingerprint off of a towel, so maybe he didn't really think twice about using a towel that was in that room. Since we've had no luck so far identifying the murderer through this DNA, we're trying to, like say, eliminate people, because if we're chasing the DNA of an investigator or the coroner or something, then we're chasing shadows, of course. I hope that's not the case, because if it is, unfortunately, we wasted a lot of time. I'm hoping that we still have the DNA of the murderer. We just haven't identified him yet.
Paul Holes addressed this with us.
The one unknown male DNA profile that they have is from a hotel towel found on the bathroom floor. We know, we could have multiple individuals, multiple males who have touched that towel prior to the homicide that had nothing to do with the homicide. However, once I learned that the location of the unknown male DNA that they found was in the same kind of stain in which some of Rose's blood was found, I put a little greater weight that gives me a little bit more confidence that maybe this unknown male DNA is possibly from the offender. Extensive examinations have been done on that towel. I had that sent out, plus some other items. And I don't know how much Sheriff Rotter wants revealed, but I will just say that right now we didn't find more of that unknown male DNA off of that towel, and that gives me pause. Why not? If this is an offender, because we know the offender cleaned up. If he's using that towel to clean up, wipe his face, wipe his hands, why is he just leaving it in just one very discrete location? And it happens, but I'm not entirely confident. In fact, I probably put my confidence level at less than 20% if I want to quantify it, that's the actual offender's DNA.
So, we have potential murderer DNA, iffy at best. Where does that lead? We asked Sheriff Rotter if it was possible to match this DNA sample against CODIS.
We've compared it against known DNA samples in the databases and have not come up with anything. And so, obviously somebody would have had to been arrested for a serious crime, and DNA would have been gathered. And that database is a database that grows, by leaps and bounds today. But back in the 1980s, it didn't exist at all. So unless the person was into the system here more recently, their DNA is just not going to be there. And the rules about CODIS, the DNA data bank, is such that you cannot put a DNA in there unless a person committed a crime, and they fit the criteria for being included. So we cannot leave that DNA in the database to be matched up every single day. So what we have to do is every once in a while go back and run it again, and just do that from time to time.
This angle appears to be a dead end.
If we could have made the ID by way of DNA for this case, I really feel like our case would have solved the other two cases.
We do have one prime suspect that Sheriff Rotter hoped to connect to the case by DNA. We are talking about Raimundo Esparza. If you recall, investigators believed that the fingernail kit found in William Kyle's hotel room belonged to Esparza. But any DNA on the nail kit had deteriorated to the point that it was untestable. The only DNA that was testable, not degraded, was under William's nails, and it proved to be his own. This was determined when the fingernail scrapings were sent to the Morton Crime Lab in 2009. And no DNA of Raimundo Esparza or anyone else other than William Kyle was found at the crime scene, even after subsequent testing in 2009. Paul Holes.
You just have to find Esparza's DNA, and you've closed the Kyle case. It's just, unfortunately, to date, we haven't been successful in getting any DNA that we have confidence is from the offender.
But what about the DNA from the towel in room 260, Roger and Rose's room? Was there a way to match that against the DNA of Esparza, who had died in 1983? Here is Sheriff Rotter.
Okay, so we had looked at exhuming Esparza's body, and we actually got lucky, and we did not have to do that. Esparza was a veteran, and he was treated for many ailments through the Veterans Hospitals system. And one of the reasons that he became a suspect, one of probably a couple reasons, is that he did have a tendency to come to Iowa and seek treatment at the Veterans Hospital in Iowa City, which as a crow flies is about 20 miles away from where these murders took place. He eventually passed away at that hospital in Iowa City, and an autopsy was performed, and they took samples of several different cells, organs, and whatever, and by some miracle these were still being held. It actually took the lab quite a bit of work. Unfortunately, a lot of the DNA was actually destroyed by the way it was stored. It was the samples were actually encased in paraffin wax, which allowed the DNA to rot. So while that was worked on, we also found next of kin for Esparza and actually found his daughter. And so we were able to compare all that to what we had, and really the daughter's DNA was really good because it's new and we didn't have to worry about whether it had degraded or not, and there was not a match. The thing you always have to worry about when you're talking about the father of somebody is, are they really the father of somebody? And we don't know that to be completely 100%, but it is very, very likely that she is the daughter. There's not a whole lot of reason to believe that that she isn't. We talked to the mother, and it's pretty well established that this is his daughter.
The DNA obtained from Esparza's daughter was matched against the sample taken from the hand towel, and per Sheriff Rotter,
there is not a link, at least with that sample.
However, Rotter doesn't rule out Esparza's involvement.
Keep in mind that we've always been open to the fact that maybe there was more than one person that took part in this crime, and maybe we have the other guy. That's always a possibility too.
As Paul Holes bluntly stated,
until Esparza's DNA shows up, somewhere within the items of evidence in Rose and Roger's case, it's impossible to say for sure that Esparza is the one that was there killing them.
But he says not to rule Esparza out either.
Even though the DNA testing has not shown Esparza as being the killer, I don't eliminate him.
There are other potential suspects whom we discussed at length who may be ruled out by DNA. Again, this is true only if the DNA sample found on the towel actually belongs to the killer and all the familial relationships are as straightforward as they appear. Sheriff Rotter collected a DNA sample from Marcella Atkinson, and the sample obtained from her does not match the sample from room 260, which is obvious since the sample came from a male. This eliminates Marcella. But there are others in her family who may also have been ruled out. Sheriff Rotter emailed us the results of this branch of inquiry, quote, "We have tested Marcella's DNA to see if the unknown DNA is related to the Hatcher family, as no DNA profiles were ever acquired for Floyd or Charles. It was determined there was no related familial DNA between Marcella and the unknown. This, of course, is all dependent on the idea that Marcella is the true daughter of Floyd Hatcher. We have no reason to believe she is not his daughter, but it does leave open that possibility, however slight." Despite the various roadblocks he has encountered, Sheriff Rotter remains committed to working the DNA angle in the case.
We're still running down DNA. We'll run down as much DNA as we can. We'll keep at that. We're going to keep working with the labs to see what technology comes along. Assuming that we do not identify this DNA as being somebody who was involved in the investigation, assuming that this is still suspect DNA, we're going to keep pushing that and keep finding ways to get a better test. This was a towel, of course, that had DNA, and there was quite a bit of DNA. And if you think about this, we're talking about the loci. We have 19 loci. Is there other locations on that towel that have the missing loci? You have 4 copies of a jigsaw puzzle, and in each copy, a piece or two is missing, but not the same piece. And it's possible that those missing pieces of loci are there, they're just in other samples on the towel. So they have broken it down to testing more. Now, unfortunately, we keep missing the same loci. we're kind of pulling back a little bit from that because we don't want to exhaust our evidence. We need to keep our evidence so that we can still use it for future testing. And unfortunately, with a lot of DNA testing, you actually destroy the sample. So we have to be very careful. But that's one of the angles that we're looking at, different methods for determining the DNA profile, maybe giving a better indication of what those missing loci are and filling in that puzzle.
Unfortunately, the newest, hottest DNA-related technological crime-solving methodology appears not to be available in this case. We are talking about ancestry DNA, the genetic genealogical tracing method that uses a DNA sample, unmatched to anyone, to hone in on a relative of the unsub who has submitted his or her DNA for genetic history purposes. Sheriff Rotter tells us that the sample we have from the towel is not enough to perform this type of analysis.
I wish it was better. I wish it was all 21. It would help us a lot when you talk about things like family DNA and like Ancestry.com type DNA, where you want that entire profile. At this point in technology, we need all 21. What this would do would give us a very, very good comparison DNA. If we had suspects, it would be an awesome comparison DNA, but it doesn't get us where we need to be as far as ancestry goes. So we don't have the entire profile, but we're awfully close.
He remains hopeful.
Maybe it's possible that ancestry type DNA will improve to the point where you don't need the entire spectrum. I'm hoping that maybe that's going to come. I'm told that DNA makes leaps and bound improvements on a yearly basis. Obviously, the biggest thing we have against us is time. If it is somebody that can be identified, are we able to arrest them? Obviously, if it's a Sparza, we can't. If by some way, some miracle that it really was Charles or even Floyd, these people are all gone. But I think really we got to the point where the family just wants answers. They understand that the chance of someone going to prison for this case is probably pretty low. But if they could just get an answer as to who did it, and maybe if you knew who did it, you might be able to figure out why and maybe close the book on this. I think that's what the family's after. That's what I'm after. And maybe if we still continue to press on the DNA angle, that we'll finally get there.
Paul Holes is not so optimistic.
This DNA sample is a poor sample at best. It's a mixed sample with the victim's own DNA. It's very low levels. There isn't, you can't, in fact, I think we've possibly completely consumed it with all the testing we've done to date. So that's where it's so incumbent upon trying to find additional areas that could have a better sample of this unknown male. And that's what I was trying to do. It was like, okay, before I got involved in the case, they had this unknown male DNA, but it's not good enough. We want to be able to search CODIS. We want to be able to do genealogy on it. Let's find, there's got to be more, of this male DNA somewhere. And unfortunately, with the items that we had tested, we did not find that.
He says the best alternative we have is to continue to use the DNA to match to someone known to investigators.
The profile exists. It can be directly compared. So that is something where, such as comparing it directly to a Sparza as well as anybody else that becomes a suspect in this case.
Of course, there are arguments to be made that a serial killer at work is very unlikely in the 3 hotel murder cases. For one thing, as we heard earlier, serial killers are very rare. None of the fingerprints collected at any of the murder scenes match any of those at another. The soap in Roger and Rose's case was not found at any other crime scene. The Amana murders involved 2 victims, while in Galesburg and Meridian there was only 1. And yet, the similarities among the cases are compelling. All investigators can do is continue to work the cases and continue to spread the word about them through mediums such as this podcast to perhaps flush out someone who knows something. This is why Sheriff Rotter has broken with law enforcement tradition and chosen to be so open with us about the investigation. Here he is.
I understand sometimes you do have to keep things back, and we've had cases where that was necessary, but let's look at this. This happened in 1980. Some of the information was kept very close early on and understandable, but that didn't work. Now we're to the point where we're really looking at anything that can help break this case. And so we've tried it that way for many years, and now we're putting everything out there. There's really very little that we won't talk about, because if there's one thing that we could either jar someone's memory, or maybe there are people out here that really have always wanted to say something, but they just don't want to be that guy that comes forward. Maybe this is enough to convince them that a lot of people still care about this case. There's still family members and friends that are still victimized by this case, and maybe there's something that they could tell us that they've been holding back over these years. I think at some point you have to change the way you do things, and I'll tell you that in my law enforcement experience, really the more the public sometimes knows, the better off you are, and that not just for these types of cases, but just in general. If the public is aware of what you're trying to accomplish, if there's something that the average person can do to help you in law enforcement, they're probably going to do it. So I would say don't be afraid of the public. Don't be afraid of the media. The media is a very useful tool to help take care of issues that you might have. And in this case, it's information we need.
Paul Holes agrees.
As cases age, there's more impetus to release more information about the case.
We have come full circle, back to the case we began with, that of the murder of Roger and Rose. We wondered whether the brutal double killing negatively impacted the Amana Holiday Inn's business, the way sometimes an on-site murder will prove detrimental to a home sale. The hotel has since been converted to a Ramada by Wyndham and remains popular, with a water park and close-by tourist attractions. Tim Trishman told us that at the time, the hotel was not impacted by the murders.
It's very popular, a great place. It had large meeting and convention space. So we did not see any kind of blip on downward occupancy.
Ida Block, the hotel maid, told us that in fact, it was her understanding that people requested the murder room.
But you would be surprised how many people would check in and want to stay in that room.
As for her, she did not feel the same way.
The first time after they had it all ready to rent, I went in and it was cold. It felt cold in that room. I'm cold. It's cold in here.
Ida told us that while the trauma of the situation has faded over the years,
if I think about it, I can just see it. I couldn't stay home alone for quite a while after that. You know, I had a son and he would stay at the house at night because I didn't want to stay. My husband was a truck driver. He was gone a lot. So one of my kids would stay with me because I just, you had to get over it. It was kind of scary.
The irony was that Ida was not even supposed to be there that day.
This wasn't my day to work. I was working for somebody else.
If she would have only observed her usual day off that Saturday, the traumatic memory would have been someone else's. Marcella, too, told us that she actually went into room 260 and had a look around in 2018.
This last time, it was just a very strange feeling, a very uneasy feeling, a very kind of even a scary feeling. I don't know, it's just kind of hard to explain, but was just a very unsettling feeling.
As we said in episode 1, our goal with this podcast has been to try to create a coherent narrative of the events surrounding Roger and Rose's life and their deaths. Perhaps by shedding some light on this complex case and the other cases that may be related to it, we can push these unsolved murders toward a resolution. Our hope is that with the passage of 4 decades, someone with information will decide to come forward before it is too late to see justice done. Many people in Roger and Rose's lives have spent the past 40 years dealing with the trauma of their murders and trying on their own to pursue justice for their loved ones. Tammy Berkman, Rose's friend, says that she has devoted her life to pushing for the case to be solved. She has compiled a comprehensive file of information gathered on the case and continues to harass law enforcement regularly about their continued work on the case, keeping the detectives' phone numbers on speed dial. She received threats telling her to stop digging, as you may recall from an earlier episode. She even received warnings that she might be putting herself in danger.
I even had the police tell me, the police down here, different ones tell me that I needed to just stop and back off before I ended up being met.
Tammy also started the Justice for Rosie Facebook page, on which she posts regularly. She remains devoted to her friend, visiting Rose's grave regularly.
It's so hard for me, even after 40 years, to comprehend anybody wanting to hurt her, let alone do what they did.
She is steadfastly committed to trying to find the killer.
Even if the person's dead, I just, let God can judge him or them or whatever. I just want to know who, so I know why.
For her part, Marcella still desperately wants to know who killed her husband. As for whether she has hard feelings or feels betrayed by Roger, she tells us,
it's a little bit hard to talk about it. Very shocked. I feel like there were 7 years of my married life and the time preceding when I dated him since I was 15 and a half. I felt like a lot of that part of my life was wasted. And of course I feel even more betrayed now. Feel a little stupid for having on the ribbon on his casket saying, "Roger, I love you."
Marcella married again after meeting Vern Schatt in a Singles Again church group. She and Vern are still married. She is in the process of writing a book about the case.
The book is still in the process. I feel like it's done, and then I feel like, nope, it's not done. So I've got, I think, about 12 chapters.
On Roger's side, his brother Larry and his wife Elizabeth still continue to ponder the case, but 40 years after the fact, they are losing hope.
We would like to know the answers. I think we've lost so much over the history. I think we've kind of resolved the fact that it's going to be unsolved.
And many, many others have passed on, including Roger's parents, without ever knowing who killed Roger. As for little Rachel, her adoptive mother, Joan Halter, tells us,
when Rachel was old enough, if she asked questions, we would tell her the truth. But until then, And then here, one of her little friends, her mom and I were friends, she must have told her daughter, and her daughter, probably Rachel, was about 8, and said, "Your real mom got killed with a gun." So then we had to sit down and explain it to her. But somebody else told her that, and we weren't too happy about that. She has pictures, and she even has one in her living room right now. She has pictures, and she always remembers horses, she would say, because there was like a horse ranch right there where we lived. So she just remembered horses. And we told her that Mommy was up in heaven with Jesus.
Rachel is now a grown woman with children of her own. Joan Halter, JC's widow, says that after all these years, they would still like a resolution to the case, to know that Roger and Rose are not forgotten.
So we're happy with you and Paul for looking into this, and I thank you. We were talking yesterday, Rachel and I, we were talking how we feel a little better.
Rose and Roger are both buried in St. Joseph Memorial Park Cemetery in their hometown of St. Joseph. This concludes Season 2 of Scene of the Crime. If you have any information about the murders of Roger Atkinson and Rose Burkert, please contact the Iowa County Sheriff's Office at 319-642-7307. Scene of the Crime is a production of AbJack Entertainment. It's narrated by me, Jamie Rice, and co-produced by Jessica Betancourt, Gray Hughes, and Mike Morford. It's written by Jessica Betancourt. Special thanks goes out to the family members and friends of Roger Atkinson and Rose Burkert who participated in this podcast. Thanks also goes out to Sheriff Rob Rotter and the Iowa County Sheriff's Department, Paul Holes, Ron Fisher, Tim Trishman, and Ida Block. If you'd like to help Scene of the Crime reach new listeners, be sure to subscribe to the show and leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please recommend this podcast to your friends. You can find Scene of the Crime on Twitter at Scene of Crime Pod and on Facebook.